Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, June 23rd, 1968, the permit expired for a demonstration/encampment that had been set up on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The residents of this encampment had been there for almost 6 weeks. This was part of an effort by the Poor People's Campaign, which was started by Martin Luther King, among others, to advocate for poor people for economic justice, not just racial justice. The next day, the police would tear down this encampment, the dozens of structures that had been built up, and they would evict the 500 or so remaining residents. So here to discuss what was known as Resurrection City is, as always, Nicole of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hey, Jody.
And our special guest for this episode and the next two as well, Jane Coaston of Vox. You can hear her on the Weeds podcast. You can read her writing, which tends to focus on American conservatism, or you can see her occasional tweets about Big Ten football. Hello, Jane.
Hello, and thanks so much for having me.
Are you going to miss football? Is football going to happen?
Honestly, at this point, I don't think it should happen. And maybe I just need to fall off, you know? Yeah. Maybe I'll take up some other hobby.
You'll appreciate it even more when it comes back this way.
You know, the generalized anxiety that I feel around college football, it might be nice to have a couple months off that.
Right.
There are other generalized anxieties you can indulge in.
So a year of generalized anxiety, 1968, it's one we've talked about a few times on this show, an incredibly tumultuous year, lots of parallels today. We are not the only ones looking to 1968, but here is something that at least I didn't really know about. At one point, 3,000 people living in an impromptu community on the National Mall. Jane, was this in your list of tidbits from 1968 that you were familiar with?
It was not. I was joking on Twitter a couple of days ago that there's a new Spike Lee film on Netflix that is talking about the Vietnam War, and apparently it does not use Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival. And somehow in my head, all of 1968 either features that song or All Along the Watchtower just playing intermittently. And then you go back and you look at the top songs of 1968, and none of those songs are on there. The number one song is Hey Jude by the Beatles, and then you get to Love Is Blue, Honey, and then Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. And at no point are any of the songs that I think of, or many people think of as being intrinsic to the experience of 1968, those songs are not a part of this. And so I think that this is one of those moments, this is a story that I am learning about for the very first time, because the conception of what 1968 meant sometimes overwhelms what actually happened in 1968.
Right. Okay. So A Beautiful Morning by the Rascals, a big song apparently in 1968. So Resurrection City is the A Beautiful Morning of historical moments.
Yes.
We're totally on board with your analogy here. So Nikki, I don't know, why do you think this has fallen through? Because it is quite a remarkable thing when you actually start to read about it and look at the photos.
Well, I think for the very reason that you're both talking about, it doesn't necessarily fit in with our images of 1968, although it should. This kind of in-person activism is exactly what 1968 looked like, but it's those more dramatic moments. This is happening 5 weeks after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy is assassinated during this encampment. There are these major explosive events, and the images of the era tend to be more about facing off with the police, these moments of violence when the police are rioting. And so a moment like this, which is largely peaceable, just doesn't necessarily fit with those narratives. It's more like a 1970s commune scene in a lot of ways.
Right. There are all those quotes about how, the 60s ended at Altamont. I think that this is a moment where actually you can see the 70s and kind of the understanding of what the 70s would be, that perhaps universal change might be too challenging, but doing it in real terms on the ground might be possible. That's when you start seeing experiences like this one.
So this was an effort by the Poor People's Campaign to bring it was a demonstration, but it was in many ways, it was an effort to sort of bring American poverty to Washington, D.C. and sort of put it on display, in addition to being a space in which people who were protesting could live together and organize and so forth. This is probably the most baseline reaction, but I'm just amazed by the pop-up community nature of this. These were not just like tents or people sort of milling about. This was an actual built community with structures, and there were field hospitals, and there were schools, and there were music venues, all right there on the National Mall, right outside the White House.
Yeah, and I think this is something that you would see at Freedom Summer back in 1964, that there would be voting schools and this combination of a place where people are living and working together and engaged in political activism. I don't think that that's necessarily new, but that the scale and the scope of it is new. And I also think that what's so important about this one is, and maybe another reason why we don't remember it, is because so much of the economic activism of the civil rights movement tends to get ignored, right? The March for Washington in 63, right? It's about jobs and freedom, but the only thing people talk about is the freedom.
And I think that really is very telling about how we perceive of the civil rights movement as being a one-to-end personal racism, the racism within the human heart, rather than structural racism that is based on the operating mechanisms of the government or the state. And it's funny because one of those things is actually far more difficult to eradicate than the other. The personal racism you feel, the reason why you change the sides of the street when you see someone of a different race coming towards you, or the reason why white liberals are just as likely to send their children to schools that have very low numbers of brown attendees, that's more challenging than the structural element. And that's, I think, in some ways why King and others are so focused on ending structural limitations. They're aware that they cannot change the morality of individuals, but they can make housing more equitable.
So does what we're talking about, the target of the protest, at all affect the nature of the protest? Because I'm just struck by thinking about, this year and the massive protests we've seen in many ways in terms of how the protests actually manifest themselves. It could not be more different, right? We're talking about something that is sort of permanent for 6 weeks in one place. They even had their own zip code. We should mention that for Resurrection City. Whereas this year's protests, especially, the George Floyd protests, have been so impromptu and fast moving. And here in New York City, there's 5 or 6 different protests all happening at the same time. What does it say that the kind of actual physical nature of this year's protest is so different from some of the stuff that we're talking about from 1968?
So I think that some of it has to do with what the target of the protest is. I mean, it's often been the case that protests against police brutality have led to interactions with the police, which then evokes more police brutality. That is a pretty common thing we see throughout these kinds of protests across the 20th and 21st century. And then, we see these kind of almost like sit-in protests or encampments around economic issues a lot. We see them with the Bonus Army in 1932. You see them with Occupy Wall Street in 2011 and 2012. And so I think that there's something about this kind of encampment, especially around economic issues and issues of poverty, that are important because they're making visible something that for most people is invisible, and that is economic suffering and poverty.
I also think that there's a sense of a created community that is both a protest of and an example of, in the former, what policy does look like, and in the latter, what policy could look like. You're seeing the creation of field hospitals. You're seeing how people are working together at a very grassroots level, not just to say that the current policies of 1968 or 2020 are bad, but here's an example of what it could look like if it were done better.
Yeah, so historians of social movements often talk about this as prefigurative activism. And basically all that means is that you model the kind of world you want to live in. And when King was doing nonviolent protest, it was this kind of activism, right? You approach protest through nonviolent action because you want to live in a more peaceful, nonviolent world. And so this is a continuation of that very same kind of, we are going to put it tritely, be the change we want to see in the world. We're going to show you what our politics looks like in action.
Right.
You also, in reading accounts of this, one of the sort of most effective results was that it just created a physical space for people to come together and have conversations and exchange ideas. And I suppose, you could say that in the year 2020, we have other sort of ways to get together and exchange ideas and have those conversations. So perhaps that's part of it as well. I do want to mention one sort of media angle, and then we should start to wrap up. But there was, I don't want to downplay this. I mean, Resurrection City had, its problems. I mean, it was sort of like not a very smooth pop-up community, and people got frustrated, and there were arguments, and there were reports of some violence and so forth. But it was also covered very much as like this destitute space. And a lot of the photos, as it was being covered in real time, portrayed it that way. And actually, the New York Times revisited it a couple decades later and unearthed a whole bunch of photos that depicted it as a much more kind of communal space and hopeful space. And so it just tells you so much about, and we're experiencing this now, right? Depending what channel you're looking at, what images are you seeing from different protests? It tells you so much about how the power of those kinds of images that emerge from these things.
Right. And it's fascinating to me because the people who were integral to the civil rights movement were well aware of the importance of imaging.
Right.
So much of the protest was not just based on a solitary moment of protesting state or federal or even local authority, but also on being seen doing that. I'll even make a comparison to the early LGBT rights movement. The Mattachine Society in the 1950s and 1960s, they protest outside the White House as well. I believe the earliest Mattachine protest takes place in 1965. And it's men and women wearing business attire. Gay men and gay women wearing business attire protesting outside the White House in the context of the overall LGBT rights movement. You're coming up at a time where being accused of being a homosexual can get you fired from the federal government. As the lavender purge that you saw in the 1950s and 1960s. But you see this moment where the visuals matter, and the people taking part in these protests are well aware and are taking control in some, as much as they can, of the visuals of what their protest looks like and what their protest means.
All right, before we go, something we do from time to time, these quick hits also on this day. So we have two of them. The first, also on this day, June 23rd, 1960, the first contraceptive pill is made available for purchase in the United States. Nikki, we could probably do many, many episodes on the impact of this moment. Perhaps we will. But anything quick you want to add right here?
Yeah, I will add that in many states it was still illegal to take that pill. In 1965, the Supreme Court would say that married couples could use contraceptives. It would be 1973 before they outlawed bans on contraceptions for unmarried people.
And then I'll just say a little something about the second, also on this day. In 1986, Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill famously denied a request from President Reagan to give a speech on the House floor arguing for military aid for the Contras in Nicaragua. This was a major showdown between two of the most powerful people in Washington, one of the most interesting relationships in political history. O'Neill prevailed over the president. I will add that would never happen in 2020 because President Trump wouldn't ask to speak on the floor of the House. He'd probably just wake up and tweet that he was planning to secretly fund the Contras. Anyway, two things that also happened on this day, and that brings us to the end of this episode. So thank you, Jane Coaston of Vox.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Jane will be back next episode as well. And Nikki Hemmer of Columbia, thanks to you.
Thank you.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. You can find out lots more, including how to suggest a topic, at thisdaypod.com. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Next episode, a Civil War reunion that does a not-so-great job of reckoning with the legacy of that war. That's coming on Thursday. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.